there was an event in the early 1930s called the Holodomor. Can you tell us about it?
I certainly can. The Holodomor lives on through almost every single Ukrainian I know. My grandmother is an old lady. She was alive, and at that time, she lived through it as a very young child. And I can tell you her story. She, I don't know all of the details. It's still something that I'm trying to really learn from her, especially now. She keeps a journal actually, and in that journal, at one point, she wrote as much as she could remember from that time. She would definitely tell me stories, sometimes in a way, in a way to maybe just lecture me if like I wasn't paying, behaving or something. Sometimes she would bring up small little moments from that. Like for example, if I was staying with my grandmother and if I was eating or she would cook something for me and I didn't want to finish eating it, she would always bring up the fact that, she lived in that time where they barely had anything to eat. They were, being oppressed so badly.
So why not? We talk about
Yeah.
Ukraine as the breadbasket of Europe, but massive agricultural exports. Why would there not be food in Ukraine?
Well, most of it was being taken by the Kremlin for the Kremlin. That's just the fact of the matter. It was being taken to other regions for other people. It was in Ukraine. We saw during this time, the Holodomor, we saw this sort of system of collectivization, or in farms, they were referred to as kolhoz. And my grandma unfortunately grew up in one. And she was very young when this happened. She had quite a few brothers. Some of her brothers were unfortunately killed because they would steal some of the produce that they would collect. The purpose was to collectivize, and you get all of this produce from these farms, these collective farms, and as I understood it, it was given to the state and it would be redistributed. And of course, in that system, the people who got the majority of it were not Ukrainians. And we saw this artificial famine essentially happen in Ukraine that was quite frankly purposely engineered by the Kremlin, and Ukrainians were suffering for years and starving and dying. It was I did learn about it in high school here. It's actually taught in many places here in the United States, but it was essentially, in the most succinct way possible, it was essentially an artificial famine created by the Kremlin in a system of essentially collectivization that starved Ukrainians of their hard-earned and worked produce like wheat. Ukraine was the breadbasket and still is, till this day, considered the breadbasket of Europe, but back then that was exploited. And the Kremlin essentially took it, almost all of it.
Yeah, one of the things that really bothers me about the historical discussion of the Holodomor is that some people want to say, well, we can't really prove, there's no one document, and I'm sure to some of our listeners, the moment they hear that, where's the document, they think of Holocaust denial, and it very much is like Holocaust denial, that the reason they took the food was to destroy the Ukrainian independence movement. And to me, that is so irrelevant and besides the point. When you make these decisions like where food goes in a state, you don't do them based on one consideration. You can't say, well, either A, it was to wipe out the Ukrainian independence movement, or it was to support the kind of urban proletariat that was the core of Bolshevik power. Why does it have to be just one? What I keep coming back to in my own thinking about this event is we all acknowledge that you have a human right to be paid for your work. This is one of the issues with North Korean laborers in places like Russia, or even in the old border towns of South Korea where there were factories. You can't send people and then their money goes to the state. You have a human right to be paid for your labor. So I think from my perspective, this entire idea that there's a debate or that there's research on the Holodomor, yes, there is, and it should continue, and it's very interesting. But from my perspective, when you steal the land and the food out from under the very people who have been living there for thousands of years, for centuries, and send it somewhere else for your own political gain and watch millions of people die. It's shut and closed that this is genocide. The exact motivations, I'm not saying it's not an interesting question to ask, but it almost seems to be misguided, an attempt to get into, one person's mind and reach some kind of definitive conclusion. Anyway, that's how I think about it. What about you?
I really have to. I ask myself this question, and I ask, why is the Holodomor? It's something that has such a big impact on my family, or had a huge impact on my family, and still arguably does. It's a period in my family's history that is there permanently, and it's something that we all know. Why, within our family discussions of this, we always recognize it as a genocide, because that's what it was. And growing up here and then learning about it in high school, I remember my high school teacher kind of pulling me aside. He was a global history teacher, and he told me, he's like, hey, I want you to know, we're going to discuss the Holodomor, but understand that here in the United States, it's considered a controversial topic. And having had family who went through this, having, heard stories about the treatment that my grandmother, who lived through that as a young child, and the fact that she lost so many of her siblings, I remember her telling me stories like her older brother, who would sometimes steal just a few potatoes and hide them in his pockets, him being pulled aside, dragged to a forest nearby, because it was a collective farm, and her hearing a gunshot and never seeing him again. How can you tell me that that's controversial? That point of history is controversial? It was a genocide. And I was surprised growing up here that there was a debate going on about it. And I don't think there should be a debate. I think the history is clear. I think we have more than enough evidence, no matter what position you really take or where you are. We have so much recorded evidence of what happened. We have so much just accounts of what was occurring. I think there was, even at that time, there was a journalist who covered it, a U.S. journalist who actually covered the Holodomor at the time, who has photo evidence of the people who were starving, the fact that there was even cannibalism happening in Ukraine. And it's obvious why it happened, who was responsible for it. We know. I don't even think sometimes it's worth having those debates or discussions, even though I guess we should, but it's just, why is it still not recognized? I think part of it might have to do with Russian influence. There's a reason why Russia doesn't recognize the Holodomor.
Oh, yes, this becomes political quickly. Same with, recognition of the Armenian genocide, because Turkey is extremely committed to denying that genocide.
And so was Russia. Russia denied, you see, we're at the point where I don't even think Russia denies that the Holodomor happened. They just denied the motive behind it and whether it's actually a genocide. And we see from, I guess you see the Russian perspective, they tried to say it wasn't a genocide. It doesn't fit this particular definition. If I remember correctly, the Soviet Union actually changed the definition of genocide, or they tried to alter it at one point, specifically so that we can't really just outright say, oh, this was a genocide by them. There's real effort from them to try to downplay this point in history, because I think it really shows at that time what the dynamic, or just that kind of relationship was between Russia and Ukraine, and the treatment that Ukrainians had to deal with, especially because of the fact that even though Ukrainians wanted to be independent, unfortunately, they, at that point, were being oppressed.